I was polishing the hood of my brand new Rolls-Royce Ghost when I first heard the heels clicking furiously against the pavement. I didn't even have to look up, I already knew it was an HOA Karen. And sure enough, there she came, storming down the sidewalk like she was auditioning for a courtroom drama. "Excuse me," she barked, her tone sharp enough to slice paint. "Excuse me, young man." I set the microfiber cloth down on the hood and turned toward her. "Can I help you?" She planted herself like a traffic cone in front of my driveway, arms crossed, lips pursed. "You can start by explaining why a 23-year-old is driving a $250,000 car in this neighborhood." I raised an eyebrow. "Because I bought it," her eyes narrowed. "I'm Theresa Jamison, Vice President of the Willow Ridge Homeowners Association, and I have every right to investigate suspicious activity. You don't just magically afford a Rolls-Royce at your age unless you're," she lowered her voice, "scamming someone." I laughed. "You serious right now?" She jabbed a finger at my chest. "I've lived in this community for 19 years and I've never seen this kind of flaunting. This isn't Beverly Hills, Nathan Dre, you went through my mail." I cut in. "I checked the HOA directory," she said matter-of-factly. "We're allowed access as board members." "Actually, you're not. That's a violation of the data privacy clause in the HOA's own bylaws," I said, stepping closer. "Page 12, Section B. Want me to print it out for you?" That caught her off guard, but she wasn't done. "I'm not here to debate fine print. I'm here to tell you that if this car is parked here again, I'll have it towed for violating community standards." "Show me where in the covenants it says I can't park my own car in my own driveway," I challenged. "I don't have to show you," she snapped. "I am on the board." "Cool. Then I guess you'll enjoy explaining that to my lawyer." Her nostrils flared. "If you're going to bring lawyers into this, you better be prepared, Nathan." "Oh, I am. I've been reading your HOA's finances for the past 2 nights. Funny how the new gardening fund has the same invoice number as your husband's landscaping business. You want to talk about scams?" Her face flushed red, and for a second I thought steam might come out of her ears. But instead of answering, she turned on her heel and stormed off, yelling over her shoulder, "This isn't over." I looked back at my car and let out a breath. I'd only been here 3 weeks, and somehow I'd already found myself on the HOA's hit list. But I wasn't just some kid with a fancy car, I was a software consultant with 2 patents and a degree in network security. And if Theresa Jamison wanted a war, she just picked the wrong guy to mess with. The next morning, 2 pieces of paper were taped to my front door. One was a notice of violation citing vague infractions like disruptive vehicle aesthetics and non-compliance with community decorum. The other was a formal request to attend a mandatory compliance hearing at the HOA clubhouse that Friday. I took both papers inside, sat down at my kitchen counter, and started drafting my response. Not with a pen, but with a spreadsheet. By the time Thursday rolled around, I had scrubbed 3 years' worth of Willow Ridge HOA board meeting minutes, audited the public expense reports, and compiled a list of 37 unusual payments, all of them routed through shell LLCs registered to either Theresa Jamison's husband or her sister-in-law. Landscaping, holiday lighting, even a suspicious security consultation fee billed for a weekend when every gate camera had been mysteriously offline. I printed everything and organized it into a binder. The cover page read, "Evidence of misappropriated HOA funds, Willow Ridge Association." I didn't bother calling a lawyer. I didn't need one. Friday's hearing was held in the clubhouse's side room, the one with the fake ficus trees and the flickering fluorescent lights. Theresa sat at the end of a folding table with 3 other board members, none of whom met my eyes when I walked in. There were 6 empty chairs lined up across from them. I was the only one on this week's agenda. She didn't waste time. "Mr. Dre," she began, trying to sound measured but already irritated. "We're here to address several complaints about your vehicle and your behavior. This meeting will determine whether fines or further action are necessary." I set the binder on the table in front of me, opened it, and flipped to the first tab. "Before we discuss me," I said calmly, "let's talk about your husband's company, Green Horizon Solutions. Did you know it's ineligible for municipal contracts in this county due to a 2019 fraud investigation?" Her face twitched, but she didn't speak. One of the other board members, a nervous man with a receding hairline, started to say something, but Theresa cut him off with a look. "Mr. Dre, this is not the forum for baseless accusations." Baseless. I turned the binder so they could see. Page 3, invoice number 1047. Green Horizon billed the HOA for $7,000 worth of soil stabilization in June. The area in question, the mailbox island. "It's paved, there's no soil." The woman to Theresa's right leaned forward. "Wait, what? I thought that invoice was for sidewalk repair." "It wasn't," I said, "and there's more, much more." I turned to the next tab, page 8. $1,500 paid to Century Ops Consulting, same business address as Theresa's sister-in-law's dog grooming company. That payment went through 3 days after the HOA security cameras were deliberately disabled. I pulled the maintenance logs. Theresa's voice cracked as she stood. "This is irrelevant to your hearing." "I disagree," I said, "because this isn't just about me, it's about a pattern of financial abuse, and unlike this hearing, I've already forwarded this binder to the county auditor's office. They're opening a case." The room went dead silent. I stood slowly, gathered my binder, and looked each board member in the eye. This HOA is supposed to protect property values, not funnel money into backyard businesses. If you want to keep pushing fraudulent fines and fake violations, just know it'll all come out in court. I turned to leave but paused at the door. "Oh, and by the way," I said without looking back, "your HOA bylaws were last updated in 2009. They're legally unenforceable under the 2016 State HOA Reform Act. You're operating on expired rules." I left the clubhouse and walked straight to my car. This time, I wasn't worried if they were watching. In fact, I hoped they were. That weekend, something strange happened. Neighbors started waving. The older couple across the street, who hadn't said a word since I moved in, brought over a plate of lemon bars and quietly asked if I'd looked into the HOA's sudden increase in monthly dues. A single mom from 4 houses down knocked on my door and handed me a folded piece of paper, an old violation notice she'd received for having a trampoline in her backyard, even though the bylaws said nothing about recreational equipment. By Sunday afternoon, I had a stack of documents and handwritten notes from over a dozen residents. Most had kept quiet out of fear. A few had tried to speak up in the past and got slapped with fines or threats of lien notices. One note stood out. It was from a retired firefighter named Miles who lived 3 streets over. He'd once served on the HOA board himself and had resigned abruptly 2 years earlier. His note was short. They altered the voting records in 2021. The election wasn't legitimate, I have proof. Call me? I paid him a visit that evening. Miles was in his 60s, built like a tree trunk, with a no-nonsense attitude and a full archive of board documents stored in labeled manila folders. Over coffee, he showed me the original 2021 election tallies handwritten sheets he'd kept after noticing discrepancies. "They claimed Theresa won by a landslide," he said, flipping open a folder. "But these are the actual ballots. She came in 3rd. They shredded the real ones and replaced them with fakes. I left the board the next week. I took photos of everything. By Monday, I drafted a community newsletter, anonymous, factual, and detailed. I printed 80 copies and slipped one under every door under cover of night. By morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. A group of residents gathered outside the clubhouse just after lunch. No one planned it, but word traveled fast. When Theresa arrived, she found over 30 people waiting. Someone shouted, "Where's the money, Theresa?" And the rest followed with demands: real elections, full audits, and immediate suspension of all fines. She tried to talk over them, but the crowd wasn't having it. Someone pulled out a copy of the newsletter. Another waved a printout of the county auditor's statement confirming an open investigation. When two sheriff's deputies pulled up an hour later with a court order to seize HOA financial records, Theresa finally stopped yelling. I stood at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, watching as the deputies escorted her into the clubhouse. They came out 10 minutes later carrying 3 file boxes marked HOA Admin Private. As they loaded them into the cruiser, one of the deputies nodded toward me. "You Nathan Dre," I nodded. "County said to tell you thanks. They've been trying to get inside this place for years. Your binder made it real easy." The crowd started clapping. Not for me, at least not entirely. They were clapping because someone had finally cracked the shell. Because for the first time in years, their voices were being heard. And just like that, the fear was gone. Theresa didn't show her face around Willow Ridge for the next 3 days. In fact, the entire HOA board went radio silent. Emails bounced back with automated replies, voicemail boxes were suddenly full, and the HOA website quietly went offline by Wednesday morning. The clubhouse remained locked, and the usual clipboard notices vanished from the community bulletin board. But the silence didn't mean nothing was happening. On Thursday afternoon, a white minivan pulled up to my curb. A woman in her early 40s stepped out with a notebook under her arm and a badge clipped to her belt. She didn't knock. She waited by the mailbox, scanning the house until I stepped onto the porch. "Mr. Dre, that's me. Detective Lena Alvarez, Financial Crimes Division, you've caused quite the stir." I motioned her inside. We sat at the dining table, and she laid out a set of documents: court orders, freeze notices, and a preliminary asset audit. "Your evidence was solid," she said, flipping through her notes. "We've verified over $70,000 misappropriated from HOA funds over the last 16 months. Most of it funneled through fictitious contractors." She paused, then added, "There's more. We think they've been suppressing actual ballots for multiple election cycles, possibly 3 years' worth." I leaned back in the chair. "How far up does it go?" "That's what we're figuring out." But we're not just talking about misuse of funds anymore. We found forged signatures on lien filings. That's felony fraud. That word settled in the air like dust. Then she asked, "Has anyone tried to contact you directly since the hearing?" "No, they've gone completely dark." Alvarez frowned. "Well, that might not last. We're preparing indictments, but if they get wind of it, someone might try to make a run for it. If anyone approaches you, call me immediately. Don't engage." I nodded, but I wasn't worried about them running. They were too arrogant to run. They still thought they could make it all go away. That night, I got a call from Miles. "They're meeting at the Jamisons' place," he said quietly. "Not official, just the core 3. I know a guy who lives next door. He saw cars pull in around 7. Theresa, her husband, and the treasurer. All the lights are off, but they're in there." "Plotting damage control," I muttered. "I'll bet my pension on it." I thanked him and hung up. I didn't plan on confronting them. I didn't need to. But I did drive past the Jamison house around 10. Their driveway was full. A black SUV idled at the curb with the engine running. I noted the plates and snapped a photo. The next morning, Detective Alvarez called again. Good timing. "We just got confirmation from the DA's office. 3 felony warrants are being issued today. Mail fraud, election tampering, and financial misrepresentation. And that SUV you spotted belongs to a private security firm out of county. They've used it before to intimidate whistleblowers." I stayed quiet for a moment. They hired muscle, looks like it, but it won't matter. "The DA is moving fast. We've got a judge lined up and officers ready." By noon, squad cars rolled into Willow Ridge. Not sirens blaring, not a spectacle, just quiet, surgical precision. One unit parked in front of the Jamisons, another near the treasurer's house. A third pulled into the HOA's storage facility near the tennis courts. By 2 o'clock, Theresa Jamison was in handcuffs, escorted down her front steps in full view of her neighbors. Her husband followed 10 minutes later after a brief argument on the porch. The treasurer, a man named Gerald Knox, was already in custody when they arrived. I didn't watch. I didn't need to. The neighborhood watched for me. By sunset, the community had transformed. People stood in clusters on sidewalks, talking for the first time in years without fear of being cited for loitering. Kids rode bikes past yards that once got violation letters for inappropriate landscaping. An elderly woman who lived alone on the corner put up a small flag in her flower bed, something she'd been fined for doing the previous 4th of July. And then came the emergency HOA meeting. With the core leadership arrested, the remaining board members, mostly silent yes men until now, called for a full community vote. It was held at the clubhouse, but this time the doors were wide open and the sign and sheet wasn't pre-filled. I arrived just before it started. The room was packed. Folding chairs filled every corner and people stood along the walls. A portable speaker system had been rigged to carry voices through the crowd. One of the remaining board members, a soft-spoken retired nurse named Evelyn, took the microphone. "We've all seen what's happened," she said. "And I think it's time we stopped pretending we weren't all complicit. Many of us looked the other way. Some of us stayed quiet out of fear. But that ends tonight." She paused, scanning the crowd. "We have 2 decisions before us. 1, we dissolve the current board and hold new elections under independent supervision. 2, we file for HOA reformation under the state's oversight program, which would place our community under the authority of a third-party auditor until we can prove financial competence and legal compliance." Someone from the back called out, "Why not both?" The room murmured in agreement. Evelyn nodded. "Both is good." The vote was unanimous. No one abstained, no one objected. That alone said everything. Later that evening, as I walked back home, I passed a group of teens standing by the cul-de-sac. One of them pointed at my driveway. "Dude, that's the guy with the rolls," another added. "He's the one who took down the HOA." I gave a slight wave and kept walking. I didn't need recognition. I just wanted peace. As I reached my front steps, Miles was waiting with a clipboard. "We're drafting a new charter," he said. "Transparent processes, term limits, and a full audit every year. I want you on the oversight committee." I hesitated. "I'm not sure I'm the right guy for that." "You are," he said. "You proved it." I took the clipboard and glanced at the sign-up list. Only a handful of names so far. But all familiar ones. People who had brought over notes, shared stories, stood outside the clubhouse demanding answers. People who were tired of being pushed around. I signed my name. The next few months weren't smooth. The audit unearthed more than anyone expected: missing reserve funds, unfiled tax documents, even a forgery involving resale certificates. But this time, the community was involved. People showed up to meetings. Volunteers helped with landscaping instead of paying inflated contractor fees. Kids painted signs for new events. The clubhouse hosted a potluck instead of a compliance hearing. And Theresa, she pled guilty to multiple counts of fraud and election tampering. The plea deal cut jail time in exchange for full restitution and testimony against her co-conspirators. Her husband lost his contractor license. Gerald Knox lost his CPA certification. The HOA recovered 90% of the stolen funds through asset forfeiture. The Rolls-Royce stayed parked in my driveway. No one questioned it anymore, because in the end, it was never about the car. It was about someone finally refusing to bow to a system built on intimidation, secrecy, and unchecked power. Someone who knew the rules better than the ones pretending to enforce them, and now the neighborhood belonged to the people again. The first real test of the reformed HOA came sooner than anyone expected. It was a humid Wednesday in July when a city inspector's car rolled into Willow Ridge. A few neighbors watched from behind hedges and porch railings as the inspector, clipboard in hand, walked directly to the newly reopened HOA office in the clubhouse. He was there less than 10 minutes before returning to his car with a stack of sealed envelopes. The next morning, I found one of those envelopes in my mailbox. It was from the Department of Housing and Community Affairs, and it wasn't addressed to me personally. It was addressed to the Willow Ridge HOA Oversight Committee. Inside, a formal notification that Willow Ridge was under a full municipal audit, not just of finances, but of property records, board elections, and most surprisingly zoning compliance. I brought it to the next committee meeting that evening. We met in the clubhouse now, with the windows open and every chair occupied. Evelyn sat at the head of the table, while Miles leaned against the back wall, arms folded. I dropped the envelope on the table and pushed it toward them. "We're on the city's radar now," I said. Evelyn read through it silently, then looked up. "They're auditing zoning," Miles nodded once. "There's only one reason they'd include that." I already knew what he meant. The quiet rumors that had begun to surface after the arrests about unauthorized property liens, mysterious permit approvals, and a cluster of home foreclosures that never made it to public auction. "What are we dealing with?" I asked. Miles walked to the file cabinet in the corner and pulled out a thick folder labeled Non-Standard Property Actions. He opened it and laid out a dozen documents across the table. Every one of them referenced homes that had been foreclosed on by the HOA over the last 3 years. But the addresses had something else in common. They all bordered the undeveloped parcel behind the tennis courts. I leaned over the documents. These were all bought by one holding company. Cedar Heights Management, Miles said, registered out of Delaware, no named officers. But I traced the mailing address. I waited. It's a UPS drop box in the same strip mall as Jamison's husband's old office. Evelyn let out a slow breath. So they weren't just skimming dues, they were seizing homes. "And flipping them," I said, tapping a deed transfer. "On paper, it looks like the HOA lawfully foreclosed on homeowners with unpaid dues. But the liens were filed under forged documents. These weren't legal enforcements, they were land grabs." Evelyn scanned the room. "How many people lived in these homes?" "At least 7 families," Miles answered. "Some were elderly, most just disappeared overnight." That word disappeared hit everyone the same way. I stood. "We need to get statements. Anyone who lived near one of these addresses, anyone who remembers interactions with the families before they left." Evelyn already had her phone out. "I'll organize volunteers. We'll canvass starting tomorrow morning." The next 48 hours changed everything. We collected 9 statements. One from a woman whose neighbor had received a lien notice on a Monday and had their home padlocked by Friday. Another from a teenager who remembered seeing a U-Haul parked at the curb, while a uniformed man handed his neighbor an envelope and told her she had 24 hours to vacate. But the most damning came from a former HOA contractor, a locksmith named Sal, who had been hired repeatedly by the board. He agreed to meet us in the clubhouse after hours. "They told me it was all legal," he said, his fingers trembling as he held a foam cup of coffee. "Said the homeowners were behind on dues, that they'd been notified. I was just there to change the locks." Miles leaned forward. "Did you ever see court paperwork? Sheriff's notices? Anything official?" Sal shook his head. "Just a clipboard with the address and the word execute next to the date." He handed us the clipboard. He'd kept one out of suspicion. The handwriting was unmistakably Theresa's. Evelyn called Alvarez that night. By sunrise, the state's Department of Justice had taken over the investigation. The HOA wasn't just under audit anymore, it was now the subject of a criminal probe involving property theft, forgery, and fraud on a scale that triggered federal interest. The FBI's White-Collar Crimes Unit requested the full archive of HOA documents, and we handed over everything. That same week, an emergency community meeting was called not by the board, but by the residents themselves. The gymnasium at the local elementary school was packed. Folding chairs filled the floor, and people stood along the wall holding manila envelopes and handwritten notes. Not one person from the old board showed up. Evelyn took the stage. "We now know that at least 10 homes were unlawfully foreclosed on by this HOA," she announced. We have evidence that liens were fabricated, documents forged, and families forced out under false pretenses. The crowd grew silent. We've turned everything over to authorities, but while they pursue justice, we have a responsibility to repair the damage. A man in the front row stood. What can we do? We start by reaching out to the displaced families, Evelyn said. We invite them back, we offer restitution, and we make sure nothing like this ever happens again. A woman in the back raised her hand. What if they don't want to come back? Evelyn looked down for a moment, then said, Then we tell them the truth. That this neighborhood wasn't silent anymore. Over the next month, we tracked down 6 of the 10 families. 2 had moved out of state. 1 was still fighting a wrongful eviction case, but 3 came back at least to visit. One of them, an older man named Walter, had lost his home after missing 2 HOA payments while recovering from surgery. He'd been forced to sign over the deed after being told his fines had reached $17,000. He walked through the front door of his old home with tears in his eyes. I planted this tree, he said, resting a hand on the small oak in the front yard. They cut it back after I left. Said it was a hazard. The tree was still standing. So was he. The restitution process took time. The state appointed a trustee to oversee property transfers, and the remaining board members voted to dissolve the HOA's authority over lien enforcement permanently. From now on, only court-approved actions could be taken. No more clipboard orders. No more secret contractor deals. By fall, the community had transformed again. Not just in policy, but in spirit. The neighborhood held its first harvest festival in over a decade. Kids painted pumpkins on the sidewalk, while Miles ran a grill near the tennis courts. Walter came back to volunteer at the booth selling apple cider. Evelyn was elected chair of the new neighborhood council, which had no enforcement power, only advisory duties and community planning. One evening, as I walked home through the now lantern-lit streets, Miles caught up with me. You know, he said, when you moved in, I thought you were just another show-off with money to burn. I laughed. You weren't wrong, he grinned. But you burned the right people. We passed the Jamison house. It was dark. A foreclosure notice still hung in the window, but this time it was real, issued by the state after they seized the property as part of the restitution fund. You ever think about selling that car? Miles asked, nudging me. I thought about it, I said, but I figure it's a good reminder. Of what? Of what happens when you underestimate someone just because they don't fit your idea of who belongs, he nodded. We stood in silence for a moment, watching the street fill with kids chasing each other between driveways no longer patrolled by clipboard tyrants. The house next door turned on its porch lights, and a neighbor waved us over for hot cider. I looked at Miles. You coming? Wouldn't miss it. We walked toward the light.